Okay, I just want to get a sense of who's in the audience. So those of you who were born between 1980 and 2000, you're called millennials. Can you raise your hands? Okay, a lot of you. Thank you. You can put your hands down. So I have bad news for you guys, and I have good news. The bad news is, according to the media, you are the most narcissistic, self-absorbed people ever. The good news is, this presentation is all about you. So I became interested in generational dynamics through my work in film. You know, when I began making films in the 90s, most of the people who showed up to my movies were young. And that's continued for over 10 years. And what I've realized is from a few thousand people with the first movie to 10,000 to millions to eventually 50 million viewers, mostly between the age of 18 to 24, this is a generation that's very interested in social change and social issues. What I want to do today is create a really powerful context to understand the people who are inside Generation Y. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of those specifics that the generation is dealing with. And then I want to move on to values. Because without that context, without those specifics, it's really hard to understand the values. And if we don't understand the values, we don't have a basis for communication. So let's talk a little bit about context. Raise your hand if you were born between 1946 and 1964. Okay, it's always, it's always tepid. It's always like, is anybody watching? Okay, those of you who raised your hands and the 50 or so that didn't are baby boomers. You are known by the other generations as conservative. It doesn't mean you are conservative. This is the stereotype that people are giving you as a generation. Now, the baby boomer label comes from the baby boom that occurred at the end of World War II and extended until the Beatles invaded the United States of America. Actually, what happened was the birth control invaded the United States of America, and that ended the baby boom. And then there was this middle generation called Generation X, of which I find myself a member. Raise your hand if you're a Gen Xer. All right, we've got a pretty good mix out here, thank you. So I call the Generation X, I call us kind of the oops generation. We were really the first generation where the birth control pill was being used, and it takes a while to get used to how these things work. So if you survey your Generation X friends, chances are many of them were unplanned. And then this is the biggest generation in history. We call them Generation Y. The media tends to call them millennials. They don't love that term, by the way. And what's amazing about this generation is around 1980, this surge in births happened. And that generation has seen the most change in the shortest period of time in history. Because of that, they are really a different group of people unto themselves. If you're of the boomer generation, we said, look, this is your stereotype, conservative. If you're Gen X, people know you as cynical. And unfortunately, if you're from Generation Y, people know you as entitled. This doesn't mean this is who you are. These are the stereotypes. So let's talk a little bit more about those stereotypes, especially when it comes to Generation Y. If you're a manager, if you're a parent, if you work with members of Generation Y, chances are these are some of the things you may find yourself saying about those millennials. And these are cliche. You can read them in the media, you can read them in the press, you can read them online over and ad nauseum until this really forms a pretty fixed view of how Generation X, baby boomers, and even Generation Y views itself. But what I'm going to say today is I'm going to challenge you to let go of these complaints and to sort of have an open mind. Because this view may just be something that's been reinforced over and over and over by repetition. And there may be some deeper levels that we can get to. I'm not saying these are untrue. I'm just saying there's much more to this story than this, okay? The flip side of this is Generation Y has its own complaints about you, baby boomers. For instance, one of their complaints about you is that you're not too savvy with technology. You know, another one of their complaints is that you don't understand them, because they do have their own language, their own iconography, and their own way of doing things. So this is a generational gap, and what the purpose of this presentation is to sort of meld those two generations together, to mind the gap, to build bridges, right? Now, if we really look at this, the dynamics of Generation Y, what really makes up this generation? Not just complaints, but what are some of the drivers of Generation Y? Specifically, we know they're pro-tech. We know they're very into social media. That stuff's a given. But when we start to look at the fact that an average college graduate has $30,000 in debt upon graduation, that starts to meld our view, right? It's a little different. When we start to look at the fact that they don't trust big institutions, that really informs our decisions about how we market and communicate. What about the fact that most of them aren't getting married at the same stage in life? Again, these begin to shape a very different view than a self-entitled little person with lots of gadgets, right? The other thing about Generation Y is they're very optimistic and they like to collaborate. So it's a teamwork mentality, and that's been taught through school and through socialization. If we look a little deeper, how do we segment the age groups of Generation Y? Well, what's amazing is more than half of them are still in college or high school age. And if you look at that age bracketing, it's pretty phenomenal, because we try to make this generation one thing. And we say, well, 30% of them live at home. Well, I don't know where you were living in high school, but I was living at home. So we forget that this generation spans 20 years. And because they're very socially connected, the younger half of the generation is very much informing decisions of the older half, and vice versa. So assumptions about how people should dress, how they should behave in the workplace, all of those assumptions are based on generations beforehand that didn't have this tight networking between young and old, right? Of course, we're all excited as companies and people who want to sell stuff. Yes, they spend $1.3 trillion a year, and that's the motivation for a lot of people to learn this information. But as you will see, this is not about marketing so much as it is about values, and whether your values align with the values of this generation. So raise your hand if you anticipate living for another 5 years. This is what the demographic is going to look like in 5 years. 10 years? OK. By 10 years, thank you, baby boomers, you're pretty much out of the marketplace. You're very much at the sunset. And millennials or Generation Y have taken center stage in all aspects of life, from social and civic organizations to corporations to politics to religion. So you've got this massive shift that's happening within 10 years, because all of those people in high school and college are moving into the workforce. This is why we kind of feel the ground shaking under our feet in the corporate world, in the civic world, because we are experiencing a ginormous, dynamic social shift. That's, of course, going to continue as time goes on. By 2030, which doesn't seem that far, really, Gen X itself is starting to be moved out, and Generation Y takes center stage, OK? And then it keeps going. So much so that by 2050, the estimate is about 40% of the Fortune 500 companies that exist today will be gone. They'll just be irrelevant. Because not so much that their products won't be relevant, not so much that their service won't be relevant, but they will fail to align their values with the values of the majority generation, which today they seem young, but tomorrow they'll be in charge. Okay, so part of the question is, how do we meld those generation gaps? How do we build bridges? And how do we begin to align our corporations and social infrastructure so that they survive, so that they have legacy, right? That's what we want to do. Well, first thing, we have to understand where the generation is coming from. What people fail to realize is this is the poorest generation since the Great Depression. So 79 years before 2008, 1929, there was a huge stock market crash. Almost 80 years later, this happened again. And when the Great Depression hit, People were living in shanty towns. We don't see that. We don't see the same world through the media lens today. But as you'll see, this is a shockingly poor generation. We'll go through statistics soon. So it sets up a very different mentality because 1 in 3 who could be employed aren't employed. And that really colors how they view companies, how they view products, how they view services, and how they view what you should be doing to help them in their world. Remember entitled? Well, again, we've programmed young people to the entitlement of the American dream, the American way of life. But that's not available to a lot of them. So this creates generational friction, right? Another thing to understand about Generation Y is very early on, this purple dinosaur showed up. And it started talking to them from the television. Because remember, this is the first generation to get babysat by a TV. And the dinosaur said a lot of things, but one of the big messages, I think it's a dinosaur. Does everybody think it's a dinosaur? I'm never sure, Purple thing. Anyway, Barney, everyone is special, right? And this message was actually coming from a very specific educational program called the Self-Esteem Movement, which started in California. I'm sorry, I know. A group of PhDs got together and they said, look, the most important thing we could do for the young generation is to instill self-esteem at every level of the educational system. And they did. And that's what Generation Y came up with, this incredible emphasis on the self, the primacy of the self above the group. There's also a conflicting message in there too, because they came up with the message that teamwork was essential. So you have this push-pull within the generational programming, and that creates a lot of mixed expectations in the workplace. But it also creates mixed expectations in their world. So you have to understand, in 1960, the average person living in a city got about 500 ad impressions a day. Seems like a lot. 500 ad impressions in 1960. I mean, there weren't that many brands, right? Today, that number is 5,000. And it's going up and up and up. So this is the most marketed to, advertised to, branded to generation in history. And what is a brand? Well, the root of brand is a Germanic word. It means get a hot iron with a symbol on it and put that onto an animal's buttocks. And Generation Y has sort of done the same thing. Not with brands per se, but with tattoos. It's branded itself. So it grew up with brands as a generation. It's inundated by brands as marketing. And then a young Generation Y person will walk into the workplace with brands that identify themselves, and they will say, I would like to work here, and the manager will say, well, I'm sorry, we have a strict dress code and tattoo policy and no piercings. That's a conflicting message for them, because they're applying to work at a company that has a brand that it wants to get into the world. Their world is the world of brands. They have internalized that, and now they're being told that their branding is unacceptable. So you can start to see things from the perspective of a young person coming into our American dream world and going like, wait up, these are conflicting messages. You told me that it was all about branding, and now I can't express my brand? What's up, right? So that creates the idea that they really have to stand out. And if they can't, then you're preventing them from part of their identity. All right, who remembers this girl? What's her name? Hermione, right? She was one of the stars of this incredible series of books and movies. Well, Hermione grew up, okay? And she became Emma Watson. That's what she was actually named in the first place. What's interesting about Emma Watson, how many people have seen her United Nations talk that she gave to the UN? Most of the young women in the room have seen it. What's powerful about this is she really redefined feminism for her entire generation. And she did it in a peaceful, non-threatening way. But what she basically said is, watch out, here we come. And the statistics are there to sort of back that up. This is an extremely female driven generation. Many of these young women are daughters of moms who participated in the women's lib movement in the 60s and 70s. They have been encouraged to excel at school more so than the boys, ergo these higher numbers of graduation among women. In China, this has gone another step, and we'll soon see it go another step in the US. Young women are becoming the breadwinners of the family in the majority of cases. That's a radical shift within one generation. Generation X, we didn't have that. The glass ceiling was set. So you can expect massive changes in how they respond to marketing, how they respond to communication, what their needs are, and who's determining where the family unit goes, and how they purchase and what they do, based on the fact that young women are becoming more in charge. And they're in a very precarious place, young women specifically, as we'll see very soon in this presentation. Now, we all know that this is a generation that grew up with video games. It grew up with TV. It learned how to use these little controllers. And then around 2001, around the same time as September 11th, Nokia released a $129 cell phone. By 2003, they'd sold 1 billion units, mostly to parents who wanted to stay in touch with their kids. So as the oldest members of Generation Y are entering college, they get a cell phone. As the youngest members are being born, they see this new device. It becomes part of their world. The appification of life is an extension of that. So we've taught them to use video game controllers. We've taught them to stay in touch. And this cell phone becomes somewhat of a life link. But it also begins to frame the world that they see, because apps have a very specific mentality behind them. They're personalized, they're accessible, they're simple, they're fun, they're cheap, they're immediate, they're shared. And so Generation Y begins to look at your business, your communication as a parent, your communication as a manager through this lens. And if they can say, you're not immediate, you're not much fun, and you're not cheap, well, if you've got 3 no's out of this list, you're in trouble with this generation. You're not connecting. So this begins to set up the value system, the lens through which they view the world and through which the world interacts with them. Now, when we look at digital habits, people love to give this generation a lot of different names: lifepreneur, beta, blah, 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 blah. The point is not the label. The point is that this generation spends tremendous amounts of time online, interacting, and in social media. A lot of it in the palm of their hand. This statistic always grabs my attention. 18 hours a day consuming media. That doesn't leave a lot of time for sleep, never mind other people. But if you watch young people today, the cell phone is on, the TV is on, often the computer is on. It's a multimedia thing. So they may spend, in South Korea, the number is 26 hours a day consuming media, because they're consuming it on several devices at once, and each one counts. So if you aim to communicate with Generation Y and you're not communicating inside a digital world, or you're communicating incorrectly inside that world, you will be deemed irrelevant. And that's an important thing to know. So how do you communicate with them? Well, it has a lot to do with who you're communicating to. So a lot of times people go, Generation Y, millennials, they're just this thing, this clump, this cloud of people. But if we start to segment them and start to go, well, okay, yeah, but there's parents, and there's people in high school, and there's people in their careers, and there's all these different groups. Some of them are in more than one group, but for the most part, these are the major groups. So let's take a look at who's actually in Generation Y, because that begins to help us understand how to communicate, how to build those bridges, right? Well, as we talked about already, 40 to 46 million of them are in college and high school age, right? That is a tremendous chunk. It's over half, depending on enrollment statistics. And this group, socially connected, super optimistic, and they're young, okay? So there's this internet meme. There's this thing you can get for your browser. It's a plugin for your browser, right? And what it does is it replaces, every time you see the word millennial in an article, it replaces it with snake people, right? So the snake people are coming, the snake people are at it again, snake people invent a new app, right? But when you look at this, you go, can we really pass judgment on the ethics of a generation before they get out of college? I mean, I'm glad that Lily didn't have any pictures of me at FSU because, oh my God. I mean, you know, the tailgate parties, I don't even want to tell you. But I think it's premature to really ethically judge them. This is a very nascent stage of life. It needs a lot of coaching. It needs a lot of direction. It needs a lot of mentoring, no matter what generation is coming through, okay? And we forget that. We think because they're so big in the media that they've already been formed. And that's not true. They're very much still in formation, at least half of them. And again, this half is informing the later half in terms of mores, social habits, what's acceptable, right? Huge group. I talked a little bit about the stress that members of this generation have, especially the poor. If you look at the numbers, it's shocking. 13.5 million of them living in poverty. It's more than 1 in 8, okay? 30%, 1 in 3 who are employable cannot get a job. Not because they're not qualified, many of them have college degrees. The workforce has shrunk in the United States. So they're experiencing this constriction of the workforce, this intensification of financial pressure at a very early age. It is similar to what happened in the Great Depression, with the exception of the fact that we have this hyper-technological world. So you can have somebody living on the poverty line or under the poverty line who has a smartphone. And that seems like a total contradiction. But that's the reality of today. So we forget, again, when we're communicating with these young people, they may not be part of the working poor, they may not be in poverty, but they know somebody who is, or they're friends with people who are. And that's part of their social network. It's part of their DNA, of their culture as a generation. We need to be mindful of this as older people in how we're building bridges and what we're offering them as a generation, right? Connected. This is the media image of Gen Y. This is the millennial that we all see on the ads, and we all see, okay, this is who uses Twitter. All right, but this is actually a very small group. The group of people with high amounts of disposable income who are in tech jobs. Pretty small group, 4 to 6 million people. So the cliche or the stereotype does not match the vast majority, okay? Click, click. Okay, millennial parents. Huge group, 20 million. 1 in 4 people in Generation Y is already a parent. What's shocking is that half of them, the women, the majority of them are single moms. The majority of them are single moms, okay? So again, when you're communicating with young people, the expectations that you set, the job place, the marketplace, people often forget who you're communicating with. So now we've got a highly educated, highly female-driven generation that is also having kids and in the majority of cases, not getting married. That is a shocking shift within one generation. This will inform massive amounts of how many of those Fortune 500 companies exist in the future. It will inform the values decisions. I don't care what kind of business you're in. When you've got 20 million young parents, many of whom are single parents, that's the largest number we've ever had in the United States. That is shifting everything about our culture under the surface, okay? So a lot of purchase decisions online, a very keen eye toward how much things cost, the value, and we're going to go into the social values in a second, okay? Activist. I estimate this group to be about 8 million people based on the number of Generation Y that are involved in yoga. This is a very amorphous group. People can be a parent, they can be an activist, they can be a poor person, they can be an activist. You know, they can be in multiple groups at once. But this is organic foods, it's health, it's social issues. These people tend to be very influential online. So heavy on Twitter, heavy on blogs, heavy on places like HuffPo. So if you're running a company, if you're running an organization, and you're doing something bad, you're in a socially transparent world. These are the folks that are talking about you. And these are the folks that you need to begin to listen to because they're saying important things that can lead you into the future, a very positive future. And then we look at sort of the older segment of millennials, people born on the Gen X, Gen Y divide, tend to be more career-oriented, tend to be a little more settled, cohabitating, may not be married, but they're looking to pay down that huge debt and have a long-term sort of career life. And those are kind of the big groups. Notice I didn't use any strange words. I didn't make anything up. If we begin to look at Generation Y through this lens of who actually is there, we begin to have a lot more empathy, and we can have effective communication. That's what's really important. So there is a strong social desire, a strong desire to make the world a better place with Generation Y, because they're at the confluence of about 10 major global crises: climate change, desertification, digital privacy, terrorism. The list goes on and on and on and on. So as they went into high school, to become competitive in college, they were encouraged to volunteer, volunteer, volunteer. That became part of their DNA as a generation. These are very broad generalizations. But again, they want to do good. And they want to see that the businesses that they support are also doing good. So here we start to get into the nuts and bolts of the values. As a business, what are you doing that's socially responsible? How are you making the world a better place? Because that's the lens that they're looking at you through, right? These are big questions to ask yourself. But it's a meritocracy. They will support brands that support their values. So let's look at those values very carefully, okay? During the baby boomer era, we looked at what was functional. You know, did the car work? Was it made in America? And how much did it cost, right? Then came Generation X, this moody, dark generation that listened to Depeche Mode. We wanted to have an emotion about the device. How did it feel? Was the cassette cool? Was it clear? Did it fit in the cassette deck? You know, like, we had emotions, right? And then came Generation Y, and they said, no, it's not just about how it works, not just about how we feel about it, but it's about, are you changing the world? Are you making it better? And can I participate? Because I'm a part of a team. We've done everything in teams now, right? So they added these two new values, and all of that was divided by price because it's a poor, thrifty, cost-conscious generation, okay? So look at it a different way. If we put these four values together and we look at their intersection, that's where your widget, your service, your product, your managerial skills, your being a rock star, whatever it is, that's where it's going to have the most value for Generation Y. I always love this slide. I see all the cell phones, and they're not pointed toward the people in the audience, which is... Anyway, the hardest one for companies to get their heads around is social value. By far, this is the most tricky one. Most of the companies that are established were established during the time of Gen X and baby boomers. We didn't have this requirement. We didn't have to give back, right? So how do we define social value? Well, this is how the Hallmark Corporation defines it. And you can see how deeply they've gone to look at, they call it corporate social responsibility. The new thing is value. So how deep have they gone in terms of their environmental impact, their business impact, their sustainability? This is how deep you have to go to succeed, okay? Because ultimately, all of this stuff is being looked at online, right? Here's an example of a very successful online campaign by a company that first established its values, then it did its campaign. Chipotle, how many people have eaten a Chipotle burrito? Most of you. Their campaign is all about responsible care for animals and vegetables and planet, right? And they encapsulated this in this video, the Scarecrow video. You should watch it if you haven't. It's been seen by about as many people as watch a primetime TV show. And what's critical is they really made their corporate social value clear. This was their advertising platform. Not our burritos taste better, we're faster, we're competitive, we're cheaper, but we're good. And we can prove it. And we'll prove it over and over and over and over and over again until you forget that any other brands exist in this space. And it's actually worked quite well for them. If you look at them as opposed to McDonald's, Chipotle was part of McDonald's originally. They're blowing up. McDonald's is flatlining with this generation. Even Starbucks is having problems accelerating its growth against Generation Y. The values aren't aligned, okay? So if you align the values, the marketing isn't that hard. If you don't align the values, it doesn't matter how many pink or bright things you paste on top of it, it ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. So it's all about values first, marketing and communication second, and this has to do with managing people in the workplace as well. Okay, so these are, I just want to make sure that's not, yeah, these are the questions that Generation Y is asking about your product or service, about you. They're asking, does your thing work? Let me go back. Yeah, okay, there. The 4 areas, how does it work? How do I feel about it? What is the true social, I did that so that you guys could take the photos. Yeah, there you go, it's okay. What's the true social value, right? And can I participate? And brands who get this right, companies that get this right, internally as well as externally, they're not having the turnover problem inside the workforce. They're not having this 2-year, I'm out the door issue. They're not having to go reinvent themselves every 12 months with another failed marketing campaign because they're doing right by their consumers or their customers, all right? Now, all of this, you have to remember, is inside the lens of social media. So if you think that you have social value, and you're putting out there that you have social value, but all of a sudden there's a Twitter storm against your company because you're hiring slave labor in China to make your widget, that's because the social value wasn't genuine. So we no longer live in a world where you can pretend you have social value, where you can greenwash. It is all transparent. It is all online. It's all 24 hours a day. And the more sort of angry elements of Generation Y, you see in the hacking, you see in the anonymous, you see in these big movements against corporate social institutions because they're making a statement. They're saying, you're not meeting us. You're not meeting our values. And for that small group of people, they're taking it out in sort of an angry way. But that's what that's a response to. Again, if you look at the values, everything makes sense, right? So when a young person evaluates you or your product, even as a parent, a mentor, they're really evaluating you like they're on a date, right? They're asking you the same questions that they would ask a potential partner. They're saying, what social issue are you fixing? Where's your app? Do you offer choices? How do I participate with you? Of course, trendy, cheaper, all that stuff, but does your OL meet your in the real world, right? Are you consistent or are you deceptive? Are you transparent or are you hiding something? Are you for women? Because now the women are out in front. And if your marketing, if your communication, if your thing is really based on a patriarchal mindset, that's very 1950s, you know? This is not a Mad Men generation, right? This is a girls' generation. Something to keep in mind. And of course, are you fun? This is a generation that grew up playing games. It wants to have fun at every opportunity, okay? So inside, I talked externally. What about internally in the workplace, right? These are the priorities: to work on a team, to work without walls, cubicle farms. Again, that's very 1980s. Is the workplace horizontal? Do I have access to the CEO? Or are they off in some tower? Is it fun? What's the passion? What's the meaning, right? Can I be myself? Can I wear my brand? That's very important. I participated in a statistical analysis of Generation Y across the board. In the workplace, 9 out of 10 issues that Generation Y faces that are important to them that aren't getting met in the workplace have to do with identity expression. The lack of their ability to express their identities in the workplace is generally seen as the #1 issue. Not pay, but the lack of the workplace to accept them for who they are, okay? Very important. They would love to be able to travel. In general, they will come in with the attitude that you're not going to meet their values and they're going to be moving on. So that's always a shock for managers, but that can change very quickly, right? They need feedback. That's what they're used to, feedback on the phone, right? All of these things are not brain science, they're not rocket science. It's just once you understand where they're coming from, you can meet them halfway, right? And so in general, these are the tenets of young people working with those of us who are in the other generations, right? They just want to keep their phone. They want to keep their look. They want to be mentored. They want to be talked to as peers, not talked down to, even if you think they're entitled, even if they are entitled. And they don't want to be, there's a big issue around privacy and how we deal with online stuff. You know, for most young people, they're posting to their social networks. If you go snooping or peering into their social networks, you're going to see some stuff that may put your hair on end, right? That's really not your business. And the inverse is true. You need to tell them what's not their business. Because in their world, everything is transparent. So if there are pieces of your business that are sensitive, that are secret, that are off limits from the public, that needs to be clarified ahead of time so that they don't share it. They don't share that stuff because they think it's fun to destroy your business. I've seen this with managers pulling their hair out. They share it because they share everything. That's part of their world, right? So setting really clear boundaries in the digital world is very, very important for a successful workplace and even home dynamic. I've seen some families go through some real turmoil about, wait up, you put that on Facebook? Whoa. You know, insert thing here. I'm not gonna tell you what it was, right? So when we look at this generation, we really look at a generation that hasn't fully emerged. About half of them, high school and college, about half of them in the workforce, but of those in the workforce, only 60% are working. So the vast majority of them haven't engaged in what we call the modern marketplace. They haven't engaged with the American dream or even the American way of life. And that's something that those of us who aren't from Generation Y need to constantly keep in mind, that the majority conversation is a conversation of that it has not yet engaged in our world. And that's amazing, because you consider in 10 years, those numbers are going to completely flip in 1 decade. And the majority conversation is going to be about participation. That's going to change everything, okay? Obviously, this is the most digitally connected generation in history. I was on a panel with a young person who works in a .com company in Silicon Valley, and a person in the audience said, it was Q&A, a person in the audience said, why do you guys think that you can become CEO in a day, right? In other words, why are you so entitled? And the person on the panel with me said, because our friends are, okay? Because our friends are becoming billionaires overnight. Because our friends are going from poverty to instant fame overnight. American Idol is part of our culture, okay? So we have the expectation that when we get it right, we go all the way to the top immediately. And he said something else that was really interesting. He said, look at the largest nation on earth. He said, it's run by a millennial, and it's called Facebook, and it's a digital nation. So when you hear that as a Gen Xer or a baby boomer, you're like, whoa, what happened to Glasnost? What happened to the Berlin Wall? These are distant memories in history books, okay? We now live in a digital world. The borders are evaporating before our eyes. And this is the first generation that has a global, truly global view of themselves as one thing. That is going to have, and it is already having, lasting and profound impacts in every area of our lives. Because overall, globally, they are disenchanted. They are disenchanted with these big social institutions that promised their parents retirement and instead sent them home with the box of their things before their time was due. They're disenchanted with the college institutions which charge them a lot of money for a degree with which they cannot get a job. And so this global wave that we see ebbing and flowing through Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring and all of these movements, these online movements, it's a consequence of how they feel about the value system that they're inheriting versus the value system that they have. That is the clash. So again, globally connected, disenchanted, emerging. I'm not saying all this stuff to scare you. I'm saying all this stuff as a bit of a cold shower. This is the reality, okay? And once you understand the reality, you can begin to work with it. Because they're also a very empowered generation. They are, as a whole, the most educated generation in America and globally. And when something is threatened, like the internet, they stand up for it. So they have the ability to really make positive change. And they are, again, a very optimistic group of people. These are massive generalizations. You're going to find exceptions to all of them, right? But we're talking about the bulk. And the bulk is a big bulk. 80 million in the US, 2.3 billion people worldwide. Half of the world's population is under the age of 35. That's never happened before. That's many more people than lived on the planet in 1950. So when you start to sort of understand the size of the wave, you can kind of go, wow, how am I dealing with this tidal wave? There's really only two ways to deal with the tidal wave. If you're standing on the beach, you can do one of two things. You can dig a hole and stick your head in it, or you can grab a surfboard. And my guess is that you're the type of people that want to surf. This is the biggest human wave in history. And what we're seeing is we're just seeing the beginning of them connecting across boundaries, across social barriers, across race barriers, across economic barriers. It's like neurons of a brain are starting to connect, right? And at some stage, you have this global consciousness that emerges. With us, it happened with print and with TV. That wasn't instantaneous. With them, it's instantaneous. And because it's instantaneous and because it's global, it means their consciousness is moving as a whole. When we do studies in China, when we do studies in Africa, when we do studies in Asia, when we do studies in the Pacific, when we do studies in America, the values are surprisingly similar. That's never happened before. So what I assert is those of you who have children have seen a moment with your child. I saw it with my daughter. She's 18 months old now. There was a moment where she looked into the mirror and she realized that she was a separate thing. It was self-consciousness. The moment that the entity realizes it's at the same time part of the world and separate from it, it becomes empowered. And that's what we're seeing with Generation Y. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see their awakening. And the big question is, those of us who are parents, who are managers, who are communicators, who are marketers, who are selling, who are buying, who are participating in the economy, who are participating in the American dream and the global dream, what is our legacy to them? What are we teaching in the next 5 to 10 years? What are we giving them so that they can be empowered in the world that they're inheriting? So that they can be the best that they can be. Because our job's not over. We're not dead yet. And they're not fully formed yet. And so we can be based in complaint. We can be based in the framework of generational clashes. Or we can be based in bridges and really drawing out the best in each other. And I assert that that's our global mission. That's what we have to do. Thank you very much.